Alrighty, good evening, everyone. Welcome back. As we complete Sefer Zecharia, we're going to be learning chapters 12, 13, and 14 this evening. It's quite ambitious, but we're not going to focus on all the details. We're going to focus on a couple of different pieces and themes and a few, specific sections. Just as a reminder, we're not going to meet for the next few weeks, and we'll pick up after Pesach when we finish Malachi, and I'll send out some more information about that. As well. So I'm going to post in the chat the source sheet if you don't already have it. And we'll get started. Okay. So when it comes to chapter 12, right? Chapter 12, 13, 14. So when it comes to chapter 12 focuses very heavily on the leadership living in the land of Yehuda. Because remember, Zecharia is living during the time period, Jews are coming back from Bavel, and so they're reinstituting essentially a commonwealth, a state in the land of Israel, and it's not so easy to do so. And chapter 12 is going to focus on a vision of a better future when the leadership is back and steadfast in the land, right? Up until now, we've learned about the people, we talked about the geography. Now we're going to focus primarily on the leadership, which is always kind of housed in Yerushalayim. So that's what we're going to see a little bit in chapter 12 this evening, and we'll focus on just a couple of pieces within chapter 12 itself. So without further ado, I'll share my screen and we'll look at some of the pieces inside together. So the pasuk tells us, Masa Devar Hashem al Yisrael, right? So there's a prophecy that we're about to read about. Okay, let's jump to chapter verse 2. Hine anochi sam et Yerushalayim. I will place Jerusalem safra al lechol ha'amim. It'll be a staggering cup to all of the nations. He's describing some sort of battle or war that will happen like literally up into the walls, up into the gates of Yerushalayim. Jerusalem will be a stone, a very hard stone, meaning it's going to be like a fortress. The nations are coming to attack it, and Jerusalem stands firm. Most Mefarshim assume that what we're reading about here is once again the battle of Gog and Magog, right? That's described in many different places throughout the Nevi'im. This is the battle of the end of days, and Yerushalayim is steadfast, right? So what happens? God's going to come to our rescue. All the horses will go crazy, right? The horses, the chariots. I will open my eyes upon Judah. The horses will be blinded. Meaning God will save us through miraculous ways in order for Jerusalem, Yehuda, to be saved. And verse 5 is when it starts to get a little interesting here, when it talks a little bit more about the particulars of the battle. Look in verse 5, Ve'amru, they, the chiefs, Alufei Yehuda, will say Bilibam in their hearts, Am tzali yoshvei Yerushalayim b'Hashem tzvakot Elokehem. Says the people of Yerushalayim, through the people of Yerushalayim, my strength will be strong. They will say about that Hashem's strength is strong, or Hashem is battling for us. But the Malbim already points out something which is going to become apparent not only in the Malbim, but Rashi and many other Mefarshim, that they assume that this description that we're about to read about is not only about the leadership of Yehuda that's going to be strong, we're going to have good leaders, but specifically says the Malbim about verse 5, V'amru, they will say, Az Yakum Mashiach ben Yosef, says the Malbim. This is about Messiah ben Yosef, which is this notion of a Mashiach that precedes Mashiach ben David and that is killed on his way to help bring about redemption, right? It's some sort of warrior that will die, Mashiach ben Yosef. And this is, he will die during the battle of Gog and Magog, and that's what's being described here. That's what many Mefarshim point out. And there's like some allusions to this massive battle that's taking place. And if you look in verse 6, Bayomahu, Asim et elufei Yehuda kikir eish. The leaders of Judah will become like a pan fire among wood, meaning we will consume our enemies. Like they will be thrown into the furnace and we become the furnace. We consume them. And like a lightning fire, a torch fire, be'amir amongst sheaves, meaning it's gonna go up in flame, and we will consume the enemies of our people. So that's what's being described here in the beginning of chapter 12, right? This massive battle that's going to take place literally at the footsteps at the wall, essentially, of Yerushalayim. And when it comes to this particular description here, what's interesting is that when we look at the description that's going to be given about Yerushalayim, this is not the first place we'll see this, but if you look at the very end of verse 6, there's an interesting piece at the end of verse 6. It says, and I'll pull it right back up again for us, V'yashva Yerushalayim od tachteha Yerushalayim. Literally translates as, and Jerusalem will once again be settled in her rightful place in Jerusalem. Okay? So if you're reading Pshuto Shel Mikra, I would argue, what does that mean? Jerusalem will re-establish itself in the right place. What does that mean? Jerusalem will replace itself in the place of Jerusalem. What is that? What does that mean? Right. Jerusalem will sprout up again, maybe like it once was. It was kind of in shambles, and now it's going to return to its place. However, the Abarbanel and many of the Mefarshim point out this is not the only place that we have references to Yerushalayim somehow being replaced or almost moved. Yechezkel talks about this in a couple of verses, and what the Abarbanel and a few others note, and I'll just tell you what the Abarbanel tells us, and it's wild. He essentially tells us that, we go to Jerusalem, right? You go to Yerushalayim, and he says, the Yerushalayim that you visit today, and he's living 500 years ago, it's a little off from the ancient Jerusalem, because it's not exactly the right place. And what's his proof? What's his proof that Yerushalayim is not exactly in the same place it used to be? What he means to say is that you have a hill, you have the Temple Mount. So maybe the temple is the right place, but like the city itself is perhaps in a slightly different order than what it once was. So what does he say? Says the Abarbanel, my proof text that Yerushalayim has shifted over the years is that, this is crazy, just listen up if you want to hear an interesting Abarbanel. Every Abarbanel is interesting. He says the following, if you go to Yerushalayim, and this is true today, he says, the makom of the burial of Yeshu is inside the walls of Jerusalem, right? Where is the burial of Yeshu today? This is crazy. This is the Abarbanel. The church
is it Bethlehem? No, it's in Yerushalayim, but it's
in Yerushalayim. It says it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? Is a holy place for Christians. He was believed to have been crucified there and perhaps buried outside, but essentially they believe his burial place where he was buried was inside the walls of Jerusalem. He says, and this is a crazy thing that he says, listen, and this is interesting because often we think today when people talk about the death of Jesus, people say, the Romans killed him. Says the Abarbanel, listen, if the Beis Din killed him, the Beis Din wouldn't have buried a Russia inside the walls of Yerushalayim. Right? We know that nobody's allowed to be buried in Yerushalayim because of Tumah. And even more so, we know, for anybody who knows the Mishnayos and Sanhedrin, right, if you're killed by the Beis Din, you have to be buried in a separate area. This is actually the source for Jews and non-Jews being buried in separate places. It says, of course they wouldn't bury him in the middle of Yerushalayim. That would be absurd. It says, this is my raya, one of my proof texts that Yerushalayim has shifted. We would argue today, well, Yerushalayim has been built in different ways. The walls of Yerushalayim today, we know, were not the same walls that were 2,000 years ago, right? They've been built by different people. So it's a really interesting proof text that he gives, but he says, this is the proof that Yerushalayim has shifted over the years, and it will once more, the holiness of Yerushalayim will once more return to where it used to be. So it'll be focused maybe more around Har HaBayit. It's just an interesting comment that the Abarbanel makes that I wanted to share with you. So we have this battle with the nations of the world, and then if you look in verse 7 and 8, he tells us the following. Vahoshia Hashem et Ohalei Yehuda b'Yerushalayim. God will save Jerusalem, Yehuda. Excuse me, Laman lo tigdal tiferet Beit David, in order that the glory of Beit David and the tiferet, the glory of Yerushalayim al Yehuda, meaning to say that Yehuda and Beit David will once more emerge. Right? When we think about the Amidah, we constantly ask, right, that Malchus David will once again be established, and this is what he says right here: Beit David will come back. And remember, by changing, Beit David is not really ruling as kings. So he says essentially that will return by Yomahu. And on that day, we will return. He says here, Bayomahu ke David, ubeit David ke Elohim. The house of David not will be like God, but Elohim in the Torah often means like a judge or just like a leader. Will be like a leadership, Kimalach Hashem lifnehem. the house of David will appear like an angel of God before the people. We will look up to Beit David once more. And that's essentially what they're telling us will happen in the future when it comes to the Jewish people in living in Yerushalayim. Before we conclude this chapter, I want to show you like a few little pieces here, and then we'll move on to the chapter 13. But I want to show you a few interesting pieces here. Verse 10. V'shafachti al Beit David. He says, I will pour upon Beit David v'al Yoshev Yerushalayim ruach chen v'tachanunim, right? Not anger, not murder. I will show chen, graciousness to the Jewish people and to Yehuda. And he continues and he says the following. He says, Et asher dakaru, and he says, I'm going to give them chen, and they shall look upon me because, why would they look upon chen to Hashem? Because of dakaru, because I have thrust him through, I have stabbed him. What's it talking about here? V'saftu alav, they will then mourn the death of this person, ki misped al hayachid, just like they mourn the one, v'hamer alav kemer al bachor. They will be bitter over his death like the firstborn. Now, anybody who's hearing this knows how the Christians take this particular approach, right? They see this and they say, this is their God. He was like the Bechor of Hashem. He was killed, Dakaru, and they're going to mourn over him. That's not our approach. Our approach is to say that this is Mashiach ben Yosef, who is going to fight our battles and save the Jewish people, but will die on our behalf, meaning he will die in the battle. And then eventually Mashiach ben David will come around to then lead us into the ultimate redemption. Right, that's the approach of Chazal when it comes to these particular psukim. When it talks about that death, and there's going to be a great sadness in Yerushalayim over his death. In verse 11, it tells us there's going to be a misped b'Yerushalayim ki misped hadad rimon b'vika'at miGideon. It's describing some great mourning that will happen in Yerushalayim, and he then lists a bunch of families. It's fascinating. He lists families, some of which are familiar to us. For example, who's going to mourn? Beit Natan, the house of Natan, which they say is like Natan Hanavi. Mishpachat Beit Levi, they're going to mourn. Mishpachat Hashim'i, who's one of the sons of David HaMelech. They're all going to mourn over the death of this one individual. So chapter 12 describes the importance of the leadership of the Jewish people and how they're going to return. One of them, Mashiach ben Yosef, is going to die in order to save us. We will mourn over his death, but ultimately Beit David, Malchut Beit David, will return to ultimately redeem us and push away the enemies of our people who are coming toward Yerushalayim at the end of days to destroy us. And that seems to be the gist of chapter 12 and what chapter 12 is really trying to get at. Do you have any questions or thoughts on chapter 12? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so let's jump to chapter 13. Chapter 13, when it comes to chapter 13 is going to sound very familiar because he picks up on themes that are prominent in like half a dozen prophets. A major motif of chapter 13 is overflowing water that will come from Jerusalem, right? This notion that it will be cleansed like a mikvah. We see this all throughout chapter 13, and this appears in many other Nevi'im as well. So this is not novel to Zecharia, but again, now he's going to describe this ultimate redemption of the Jewish people, but within that, he adds his own little commentary about individuals who he wants to be punished and about the, what's going to happen to those who need to be dealt with in a particular way. So let's look at a couple pieces in chapter 13 that describe what's going to happen in the end of days, which is really a good thing for us, but they'll show what happens to the, specifically to the false prophets. So what does he say? A spring, a fountain will open up to Beit David, again, for the house of David and for the people of Jerusalem. So chatat, we often think means to sin, but chatat, even in Chumash, sometimes means actually to purify, as does nida, right? Nida we often think is tuma, but chatat and nida can have a reference to a purification process. It really just matters about the context. But chatat and ulanida, meaning to say they will be purified. On that day, essentially, I will cut out all the atzabim, like atzabei and kesef zahav, the idols. You're never going to hear them ever again. Idols are going to be gone. Vigam, and this is important, all right, we're going to have Malchus David, so who do we have to get rid of? All the false prophets. the false prophets. I will remove the false prophets from among us. And he explains in verse 3, get rid of the sheker, who they speak about Hashem. And once again, this interesting verb, udikaruhu, he will like essentially thrust through them, stab them. Avihu v'imo yoldav b'hinavo. He will essentially destroy the prophets. He will destroy those around him who are kind of allowing this to happen in order for us to have only true Nevi'im and true Malchut Beit David. Verse 4 describes for us a really fascinating comment. Verse 4, I want to show it to you. The prophets will be embarrassed, meaning the false prophets. All the false prophets who think they're so great and try to trick people into thinking their prophecy is real. What does the pasuk say? V'lo yilbeshu aderet se'ar. They will no longer wear a furry or a hairy cloak, leman kachesh, that they use to deceive. Okay, what is going on here? Any thought? What does it mean? They're no longer going to wear their furry or hairy coats in order to deceive other people. Thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking about the Yaakov and Esav.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where Yaakov puts on the hairy whatever, and he's being false. You know, he's not being who he really is. So that's a reference to that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's certainly one way to look at this verse, which is it's an allusion to trickery.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a Navi Sheker who wore something like that?
So when it comes to Nevi'ei Sheker, this is what's going to be important, I think, here. Thank you for that, which is that Nevi'ei Sheker, both historically, there's often descriptions about Nevi'im. Like, for example, Elisha is always made fun of because he's what? What was Elisha always made? Like, they always describe them in certain ways. Elisha was made fun of because he was, anyone remember?
Elisha.
Elisha.
He was bald, like Kedar.
The Navi. Yeah, he was bald, right? So he was correct. They often describe Nevi'im in very specific ways, and sometimes Nevi'im can be described as wearing cloaks. They wore these like almost like it's an honor, as like a, you want to be modest. They wore like a particular type of cloak, and you knew that was a Navi. So they would seemingly wear these furry coats. So I think about somebody wearing a fancy coat. So almost like the Navi had particular coats. And it's interesting, the Rashi actually says the following, he's not Rashi. Rav David Kimchi says essentially that he thinks that this is not only talking about maybe the historic Nevi'ei Sheker, but he thinks it's talking about present day Nevi'ei Sheker. He essentially is describing for us, the people in Nevi'ei Ha'umos, in the nations who are of Edom and Yishmael, who get up and speak. And what do they wear? They wear these cloaks in order to seem like ascetic people. Right? So you could almost see him describing like a monk or something to that extent. Right? He's describing people who look like they're tzniua and they're good. But at the end of the day, they're really just trying to be makrish people. They're trying to trick them. They're trying to get them to do something that they should not be doing. And so essentially, we're going to get rid of them. Nobody's going to be tricked by their clothing anymore. It's like a sheep, a wolf in sheep's clothing. So that's essentially what he's describing here. Okay. So as we move along in chapter 13, what ends up happening, just jump down here a little bit, is that the people are lying about Hashem, about Torah. They're trying to get people to do bad things. And so essentially what's going to happen in verse 7, Cherev uri al roi val gever amiti. A sword will come up against my shepherd, meaning they're going to try to attack Mashiach. And what's going to happen? Hach et haroeh. We will hit back and smite the shepherd, and we're going to scatter him, meaning we're going to scatter their shepherds who are going to try to attack our shepherds. We have a Mashiach and they have their kings and their leaders, and there's going to be a massive battle. And says Rashi, don't know how Rashi felt comfortable saying this, but Rashi says, Hachet haroeh, they're going to try to hit the roeh, meaning they're going to try to attack us, and we're going to fight back. Who are we going to fight? Says Rashi, Melech Romi Harisha. We're going to fight back against the king of Rome, the wicked king of Rome, who I can only imagine is a looks like a veiled reference to the Pope during the time of Rashi, living during the Crusades. So essentially, we're going to fight back, and this is a reference to destroying the kingdoms that are trying to attack us. This is what we're going to do. And what is then at the very end of our chapter here, it's it happens to be a short chapter, chapter 13. What's described at the very end of chapter 13 is that there's going to be some sort of battle, and what's going to happen at the end as a result, there's going to be two parts. Something's going to split. Yikartu yigavu, something's going to split into half, but then again, so there's going to be a third. It says Rashi and says a number of other Mefarshim, this is describing, just as the battle of Gog and Magog is happening, some Jews, according to this particular prophetic vision, a third are going to be left in Yerushalayim and 2/3 may have to leave Yerushalayim. They're going to have to leave, they will be returned, but they're going to have to leave essentially for an interim period, verse 9, and I will bring that third through fire to do what? In a positive way, to shape them, just like you put silver and you refine it in a furnace. So the ones that remain in Yerushalayim will be refined in Jerusalem and they will become, let's say, holier. The 2/3 that left will eventually come back. And we'll see that a little bit more in chapter 14. But essentially, he's describing some sort of exile that will happen at the end of days from Yerushalayim, that eventually the people will return, but something's going to happen in the interim. And what I think is really fascinating about this description is that redemption here is not described as an upward trajectory. Even this battle of Gog and Magog, Mashiach ben Yosef dies. 2/3 of the inhabitants of Yerushalayim will be exiled. Only a third is left. And then Mashiach ben David will come and eventually, bring everyone back. But Yerushalayim itself won't be touched, meaning we'll be able to defend Yerushalayim, but somehow 2/3 will be exiled. It's a little obviously ambiguous. Fill in all the details of what's going to happen. A little bit unclear. But it did remind me of 48 and 49, 1948-49, when the old city, right, was the exiled, right? The Jews were forced to leave the old city of Yerushalayim. So part of Yerushalayim was empty, and then eventually we will return, and we did return, 19 years later. So there was a part of that kind of reminded me of that in that particular moment. So that's the description that chapter 13 gives us. But before we move on, any questions or comments so far? Okay.
Yes, I didn't realize that the Mashiach ben Yosef is going to die. Yeah, it was new to me. I mean, I didn't know how it was going to be reconciled with having two Mashiachs, so it makes sense. But I never actually, heard it.
Yes, Mashiach ben Yosef is going to come and essentially die in defense of the Jewish people, which obviously, the notion of Mashiach ben Yosef appears in the Gemara, and it also seemingly appears in earlier sources. It's therefore no coincidence that when it comes to Christianity, the name that they assign to the father of their Messiah is none other than Joseph.
Yeah.
Right. That our Mashiach, the notion of a Mashiach ben Yosef clearly predated their Messiah, right? Because that's how they got it. Just like you see them picking out all these verses, that's just an interesting thing to know.
So is Mashiach ben Yosef going to be kind of like a dress rehearsal?
Yeah, to an extent, he'll fight for us, right? He'll die in battle in our defense, and then David will come and finally kind of finish the redemption. In some ways, it also reminds us of the very beginning of our story. Who dies and doesn't finish the redemption for us?
Gedalia?
Go further.
Further what?
Further back.
Who died? Oh, that far back.
Right, yeah, he doesn't make it to the land of Israel, right? He dies on the way to Israel. Hashem says you're not going to enter, and Adnei V'Esrim, and then Yoshua takes over. And there's more to be said there. There's a lot of Kabbalistic connections to be made, but essentially that's a description that is often made. So now let's turn to the final chapter of Sefer Zecharia. Long, after all these small Nevi'im, now we had a 14 chapter, book. Don't worry, Malachi's only 3, but now we're at the final chapter. So the final chapter will continue what we've been describing. We'll continue to describe this kind of very end of days, destruction, redemption, kind of everything that you imagine eschatological prophecy should look like is really described in chapter 14. And also we have very famous lines in chapter 14. For those who looked ahead, right? We say it all the time in Aleinu, right? Like it's there, right? This is the place that we get it, right? It's in this particular chapter that we'll see it. And chapter 14 is a little bit longer, it's 21 verses, but we have a little bit, I left a little bit more time for chapter 14, but again, we're not going to read it all inside either. So let's take a look at parts of chapter 14 to see how he ultimately describes this redemption, the death of this Mashiach ben Yosef, the battle, the destruction, and eventually the redemption itself. Okay. Hine Yom Ba LaHashem. The day of God is coming, right? This is like, the day of the Lord is coming. This is where they get it from. What's going to happen? The spoils will be divided amongst you, meaning it's going to be a battle. Spoils are going to be divided, right? That's what happens when you have war. What's going to happen? All of the nations of the world, all the nations of the world will come to Jerusalem, la milchama, in battle.
Sounds like the United Nations.
Exactly. Vinil kedah ha'ir, they will encircle and essentially cut off Yerushalayim from the rest of the world. V'nashasu batim v'nashim tishkavna. What will they do? The houses will be destroyed. The women will be ravished. So what they're describing here is not a salvation. This is a bloody war. Now, what's interesting to note, and again, it probably takes a lot more time to go through this all, is that in some Sifrei Nevi'im, we don't have a very graphic bloody battle at the end of days. Sometimes it's very positive. This one seems to take the approach, Zecharia, that no, there's going to be war, people are going to be hurt, and that's his description. Right? That's how he describes the battle at the end of days. He says, Yatsa Chatzia Ir Bagola, here not 2/3, here he says a half will leave Yerushalayim. But the rest, the remnant, will remain inside the city of Jerusalem. So some go out to exile, some remain. But then what happens? Once this exile takes place, as I previously described, V'yatsa Hashem v'nilcham b'goyim ha'hem, God will fight on our behalf. Kiyom hilachmo b'yom krav, like when Hashem fought on the day of battle. What exactly is the day of battle? Maybe it's a description to Egypt, perhaps. Where we say, we describe God as like a fighter valiantly fighting on our behalf in Az Yashir. So maybe that's what's happening. And then what will happen? We get for everyone, I'm sure here, hopefully has been to Yerushalayim. And what happens? Ve'amdu raglav bayomahu. What will happen? Hashem's feet, in a metaphoric way, will stand firm on Har HaZeitim. Har HaZeitim is directly opposite Har HaBayit. Asher al pnei Yerushalayim mikedem, that's east of Jerusalem. What's going to happen? V'nivka Har HaZeitim will be cut in half, right? If you're standing, at the Kotel, if you could elevate yourself on Har HaBayit and look straight across to Har HaZeitim, it's very high mountains, split in half. What will happen? Split in half, and a massive, valley or pathway will emerge. Umash chatzia har tzafona v'chetzu negba. Half will go north, half will go south. What he essentially is describing here is like Kriyas Yamsuf for Har HaZeitim, right? There's going to be a split, a massive split in the mountain, whether it's literal or figurative, I don't know. There's going to be this massive split, and that's going to eventually, we'll see how that will continue and create some sort of redemption. The Abarbanel says, on the one hand, it could be God's hand, Yad Hashem, that does this. He says another way to look at this is that the nations of Yishmael and Edom will come to fight Yerushalayim, right? Christianity and Islam will come to fight, and they'll essentially be located in the foothills of Har HaZeitim, and the battle will be so vigorous that the mountain will essentially, the middle of the mountain is going to be opened up, meaning to say, if you were to use modern day terms, artillery, bombs, it's going to end up creating an opening, or at least historically, they used to take stone to build like towers to enter into a city. So they're going to take stones from Har HaZeisim, and it's going to end up being almost like an opening in the middle. That's what's going to happen when it comes to Har HaZeisim, which is again the mountain opposite Har Bayit in the city of Jerusalem. And what's going to happen? There's going to be a massive valley, and the people will flee. It sounds like the enemies will flee because they're going to be like something crazy is going to happen at this very moment. Some massive explosion or massive shaking and quaking and earthquake will take place, just like the massive earthquake Bimei Uzziah Melech Yehuda. This is a famous earthquake, right? Yeshayahu and many Amos, they all describe this massive earthquake that clearly was very consequential because it's mentioned in many Sefer of the Nevi'im, and it's going to be just like that one, meaning it's going to be a reminder of like that one. It's going to awaken people, and people will flee. And then we get to the eschatological moments. He says there's not going to be light on that day. It's going to be dark and cloudy, almost like you could imagine a dark fog that emerges over in this battle, and people are going to be frightened. It's not going to be day nor night. People aren't going to know the difference. It's just going to be a confusion, like a tohu vavohu. And at evening, light will come, meaning darkness first, and then light will emerge, meaning to say that something bad is going to happen. And then just when you think it's going to get worse, when darkness comes about, because it's nighttime, light will emerge. What continues? Water. A spring will emerge from Yerushalayim, and Yerushalayim will have become a spring once again. Half will go to the Mediterranean, half will go toward the Jordan River. It will always be flowing. Now, what's interesting about this metaphor is that what we know about Jerusalem is there are springs, right? There are springs at the bottom of Yerushalayim that they would bring up to the to Har Bayit. But what's also interesting here is that it tells us that the spring will be in the summer and in the winter. What's important to remember is that the land of Israel relies on rain. Our relationship with Hashem is often tied into whether or not we get rain. God withholds rain or gives us rain. So to have a eschatological vision of Yerushalayim as a place where there's a constant flow of water, essentially, it almost negates the necessity for rain. So it's this like amazing thing, like when they talk about Egypt. We want to go back to Egypt because they have the Nile. Here, he's saying, no, there's going to be amazing spring, and it's going to be, everything will be there for you. We'll get back to the Nile reference in a few minutes, but essentially everything's going to be there for you. So it's really an amazing description that we see of Yerushalayim. Famously, what's going to happen? God will be king of all the land. On that very day, everyone's going to know that Hashem is the true God. They just saw Har HaZeisim be split. Now there's going to be rivers flowing out of Yerushalayim. How can you not see Yad Hashem? And the armies of Edom and Ishmael, according to the Abarbanel, will be fleeing for their lives, and we will be safe in Yerushalayim. What's going to happen to the rest of the mountains, right? If you're standing in Yerushalayim and looking out towards the Dead Sea, and you see all these mountains, so it describes the Navi, they will be like the Arava, meaning to say they'll be flattened like the Arava. There's something to be said about this notion that these mountains, which were not so easy to live in, to travel in, they're going to be flattened because they're going to become much more kind of like farm-like lands that are easier to live on, that are not so rocky and hilly. It's going to be easier, and that's what's going to happen that's described in verse 10. And then obviously, Yashva Yerushalayim Lavetach. Jerusalem will be finally, Yerushalayim will sit in peace. So the description here is talking about our final salvation. But what happens to the enemies? Right, we saw them fleeing, but is that it? Is that it? Verse 12, Vizos tiyeh hamagefa. Plague will come and attack the nations of the world. Asher tzavu al Yerushalayim, who tried to attack us in Jerusalem. Their skin will essentially peel away or stand up, whatever that means. Their eyes will essentially melt away. U'lashono timak b'fiyim, their tongue will be stuck. An awful plague will hit the enemies who tried to destroy our people in Yerushalayim. And on that very day, Tihiyeh Muhammat Hashem Rabbabayim, a terrible confusion will emerge upon the world. This is what's going to happen in the end of days. This is like, if you think about like the approach of trying to make sure there's vengeance against the people who killed us over the years, this is that. You get to see it explicitly here that they will be punished. And they're animals too. All their animals will be killed in this plague. That's what's being described in verse 15. But now what? What happens now? Is it just us? Are we the only ones left? Like they've all been attacked? So now the Navi has to recognize and does recognize that while on the one hand, our enemies will be attacked and they will be punished, everyone else in the world who did not partake in that particular attack will have a choice to make. And their choice is to recognize Hashem. In order to make Hashem HaMelech Kol Haaretz B'Yom Hahu Yeh Hashem Echad Shmo Echad, we want them to recognize Hashem in the end of days. That is what the Navi now describes. What will happen? Kol Hanotar Mikol Goyim, all the remnants who are remaining from the nations will come to Jerusalem, or that came to Jerusalem, but maybe weren't the perpetrators. Alu mideshana vishana, they will come year after year, lihishtachavos lamelech Hashem tzvakos, to bow down to worship Hashem. Velachog et chag hasukot. What's going to happen? The nations of the world, year after year, will come and worship Hashem on Sukkot. So just as we have Shalosh Regalim, they essentially will now get a regel, Sukkot. And the Gemara in Avodah Zarah famously tells us that when the nations of the world complain to Hashem, that listen, you gave so much favor to the Jewish people, but listen, you never gave us the Torah. So like, how could you punish us for not doing your commandments? You left us as like as a nothing. You gave them the Torah and gave us nothing. So Hashem says, I'll give you one mitzvah. See if you can do it. What's the mitzvah? Sukkah. And then Hashem makes it a little bit warm and the people kick over the sukkah. We don't want any of this. And Hashem says, look, I even gave you one mitzvah to try and you didn't do it. This medrash that's in the Gemara really comes from here. God says, Chag HaSukkot. That is the holiday that you'll come. And obviously we know Shivim Parei Chag, the 70 bowls of Sukkot represent the 70 nations of the world. And then Shmini Atzeres is just for us. Right, so Sukkot, even from its start, seems to be foreshadowing what's going to happen in the beginning, or forecasting really, that in the end of days, Sukkot will be an international holiday where everyone comes to Yerushalayim. But what if they don't? What if they don't want to come? Says Hashem, the Navi, if they don't come, what's going to happen? Lo alehem yeh hageshem. I will not provide them rain. Remember, Hashem just told us that he's going to give us this spring of water. We don't need rain anymore. But I will ensure that, for example, if a country in Asia or in Europe says, I'm not coming, God will withhold rain for them. And remember also, Sukkot is when we begin saying Geshem, right? Meaning we do Tfilat HaGeshem. We don't say Mashiach Baruch Hu Gashem outside the land of Israel. Yeah, a little bit later, and even in Israel, they wait for Jews to go home. But we start saying, we essentially begin to request it. So that's what we're saying here. Right? We're getting ready for that particular area. To request rain. We say Mashiach Baruch, but we're not going to say V'tein Tal yet. So that's essentially what happens. What about Egypt? It's great. I love this. The Navi says, wait a minute. If Hashem's not going to give them rain, Egypt doesn't need rain. It has the Nile. What's going to happen to them? On what? Essentially, what he's telling them is that their Magefa will be, they will not have the Nile River, right? There's going to be a plague that's essentially lo ta'alev lo va'a. It won't go up and it won't come forth. What's not going up? What's not coming forth? The Nile, it rises and floods the delta, the Nile Delta, and that's essentially what's going to give water to the Egyptians. And if they don't come to Yerushalayim, I'm going to withhold that. So what God is saying is, you don't get out of this. You have to do this. If you want to continue to recognize me in this world, you have to come to Yerushalayim on Sukkot, all the nations of the world. And if they don't, they won't be able to. And by coming, they purify themselves. Zotia chatat mitzrayim. This is the purification. Here it's the punishment if they don't come. But essentially, im lo ya'alu l'chag, they're going to be punished for not coming. So what we see here is the international tilt or approach that he gives to the redemption of our people. We're coming up to the very end of Zecharia. Zecharia ends with two last verses, which are quite striking because of what they describe. So let's look at them together. And with this, we'll get ready to conclude Sefer Zecharia. Let's look inside. What's going to happen at the end of the days? Remember, Yerushalayim is going to be the center of the world. Everyone's going to come on Sukkot. Bayomahu, verse 20. On that day, upon the bells of the horses, we'll say Kodesh LaHashem. Who gets to wear Kodesh LaHashem normally?
The Kohen knows.
Gadol, right? It says on the tzitz, Kodesh LaHashem. But who's now wearing it? Even the horses of Yerushalayim, right? It's showing us that if even the horses are going to be Kodesh LaHashem, Yerushalayim is going to be this place of incredible kedusha, that even the horses will be Kodesh LaHashem. And the pots and the pans and everything that's used in Jerusalem for the temple or even just for the people in Jerusalem will be holy. Every pot in Jerusalem and Yehuda will be Kodesh LaHashem tzvakot. Uva'u kol azovchem, all the people who want to bring korbanos, lakhu mehem, ubishlu vahem, everyone will come to Jerusalem and they go to anybody's home. They knock on somebody's door and say, I'm coming to give a korban on Sukkot. So I'll come inside. We'll prepare your korban right here because everything in Yerushalayim is Kodesh LaHashem. And then they'll go to the temple to give their korban. And it ends by saying something interesting. Lo yeh knani od beveis Hashem tzvakot. They will no longer be, literally, Canaanites in the house of Hashem on that day. What does it mean here? Knaani, in a number of places, including in Eshes Chayil, means a merchant. It doesn't necessarily mean a Knaani, meaning maybe the Knaanim got their name because it meant merchants. Maybe they were merchants, so that's how the word came about, which came first. But essentially, lo yeh knani od, you don't need a merchant in the Harabait because essentially you need somebody to, let's say, purchase food from or do things for you, because up until the point you get to Yerushalayim, your animals can become tameh. You may not have them. You don't know how to prepare them. So it's almost like you have to get to Jerusalem. You have to get to the temple and pay somebody to get it prepared for you. It says no more in the future. All of Yerushalayim, maybe even all of Yehuda will be Kodesh LaHashem. So you don't need to do it there. You can do it anywhere. So this notion of having to do business in Harabayit will no longer be the case because we'll be prepared to have Kedusha all throughout the land of Yehuda. Sefer Zecharia, as we come to a close here, Sefer Zecharia began really describing the return of the Jews during the reconstruction of the Second Temple, overlapping with a number of other Nevi'im, including Haggai, and describing their return. And when they returned to Yerushalayim, it wasn't so easy. They weren't so into it. But then eventually, we know the rest of history. They do it, but maybe not ideal. But at the end of the day, Zecharia focuses on the future, right? Sometimes we saw him talk about the Hanukkah story. Sometimes he alluded to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash in the time of the Romans. And then he goes for the very far future, which should come speedily in our days, which is this end of days image where, right, the nations of the world, according to his approach, will try to attack Yerushalayim, and we'll be able to fend them off, and we'll be able to say this is our home, and Kedusha will once more reign throughout the world, and the nations of the world recognize Hashem and the holiness that Yerushalayim represents, that we as Jewish people represent as well. Happy to take more questions and comments. And just a reminder, we'll pick up with Malachi after Pesach. So also Chag Kasher V'Sameach to one and all.
I have a question. Why are the nations of the world suddenly required to go to the Beis Hamikdash on Sukkot? I mean, normally you don't want them there.
Yeah. So, I
They
think what's
always,
happened-
they were always allowed to come on Sukkot. I
yeah,
think.
they could always come. They could always come. Not they could bring korbanos actually. There's
Yes,
they have to give to a Cohen who could then bring it. We, later on, other Nevi'im will talk about, one day Yerushalayim and Ariel will not even be allowed in Yerushalayim. But essentially, it's trying to tell us that there will be a time where the nations of the world will finally recognize Hashem. And how do they show their appreciation? They come once a year, right? They visit, just
So
like
they
we
go,
do.
it's kind of like the center of the universe. Everybody goes there and they're showing their fealty.
Yes, 100%.
But yet a few psukim later it says there won't be any traders left, any commercial traders. It's kind of
just in that place. It doesn't say
Yeah.
ever anywhere else, just in the city of the Yerushalayim.
Yeah, I think just in maybe even just the temple, because they're
Yeah.
saying Yerushalayim will be such a holy place that business is not appropriate for that place. And they don't need it because the people who live in Jerusalem are just like, come to my house, we'll prepare everything with you. It's this really beautiful image.
It's very interesting. It's a very mixed bag. It's hopeful and it's scary and it's very interesting. I put
I think-
a
sorry.
link in the chat. Shuli Mishkin spoke about these Nevi'im last week and about
Thank you.
the broader picture. It was really interesting.
Right, I think also it's maybe a reference to the fact that at one point the Kohanim were corrupt, and there was all kinds of treachery going on in terms of money and so on in the temple, right? And that's and in fact that was like a criticism of them when with Jesus,
Exactly.
and
That was his raison d'etre.
yeah, so that this is like a turning around. It's completely the other way, the way it
Yeah.
was at one time.
We're almost
That caused
halfway
so much
there.
damage. That causes so much damage.
Yeah.
That
Sure.
were we kind of peripherally, responsible for what happened in a way. So critique of the Jewish people there, or at least an element of the Jewish people. So this is now really saying this is going to be pure and holy and good, no corruption,
Yeah.
no commerce, no nothing.
It's something aspirational too.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Rabbi. It was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Really,
Thank you.
really.
Hug,
Wishing
hug
you
Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everyone.
I'll be in Yerushalayim.
Enjoy Ali Regel.
But it's not Sukkot. Thank you.
Go back then. All right. Have a good night, everyone.